Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Tuesday, August 27th, 2013, getting through the month of August, coming up on the Labor Day weekend, and already the corporate media is just all out there with the Labor Day sales. This is your chance to come and buy some more crud that will fall apart as soon as the warranty is out there, and you can buy it on easy credit terms and blah, blah, blah. The Christmas stuff is already in the stores. Actually, it's been in the stores for a while. Been in Sam's Club. They've already got the Christmas stuff out there along with the Halloween and Thanksgiving and everything else. It's just sell, sell, sell. Hallmark actually put up their keepsake ornament display last month. And I think when I am finally emperor of the earth, I'm going to confine Christmas to the month of December. I think that's enough to make the point, because I really get tired of this whole Christmas starts in summer. And it's just nonstop pounding, buy, Christmas, 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 Christmas. And by the time we get there, it's no longer decoration, it's decor, and it's tacky as all get out. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. And yes, I'm already in Ebenezer Scrooge mode, and it's only the end of August. Manny is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And obviously, the big news remains Syria. They're still out there trying to peddle this, but there are some very interesting developments going on. There's a lot of subtleties, a lot of indications that the U.S. government and its allies really are not as unanimous on this idea of war in Syria as they might wish to present to you. The polling is still showing overwhelming U.S. opposition for any kind of intervention in Syria, even if Assad actually was stupid enough to invite UN chemical weapons inspectors into his country and then launch a chemical weapon attack on women and children on the day they arrive, which is what all of this comes down to. And in point of fact, they're already backing off of that, and now they're trying to basically transition into, well, Assad has chemical weapons and he might use them, therefore we're justified in attacking, which of course was the same thing they said about Iraq, and the same thing they're peddling about Iran. We'll talk about that in a little more detail a little bit further into the show here. Story over from antiwar.com. U.S., Britain, and France agree to attack Syria within 2 weeks. And there's an interesting quote in the story. It says, initially limited strikes aim to avoid serious war debate. And that is a very telling statement, because I'm starting to see a lot of indications, reading between the lines, that the Obama administration realizes they have failed to sell the Syrian war to the American people based on that ludicrous idea that Assad invites in the inspectors and launches a chemical weapon attack right in front of them. We know it's a lie. And based on John Kerry's Colin Powell moment yesterday on TV, we know it's a lie. They're still trying to prop it up. But even though we know it's a lie, for the sake of political appearances, they have to move forward because they have declared they believe Assad did this and something must be done. And they have to do something because they don't want to admit they were lying to us again. And they're looking for an exit strategy. And what the exit strategy looks like to me is the U.S. is going to launch a cruise missile attack before the end of this week, blow a bunch of stuff up, declare a moral victory, and get the heck out of there. And hopefully by the next Tuesday, when we all come back from our Labor Day weekend, it'll sort of be a fading memory in the mind of the American public. And I don't think so. So Obama's going to slap Syria around to prove how butch he is, and then hope that we all forget about it. But you know something? This whole idea that they were going to sell this lie about Assad and chemical weapons was predicated on the assumption in Washington, D.C., and we know what assume means, that we, the American people, had forgotten all about the lies regarding Saddam's nuclear weapons. And we didn't. We absolutely didn't. And maybe, the war hawks have learned something useful here, which is that we, the people of the United States of America, are not as stupid as the politicians like to imagine we are. And the days when leaders could put out nonsense, like torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, Spanish mines in Havana Harbor, and be believed and trusted by the majority of the public, those days are gone for good. The American people are awake. And they understand the biggest reason not to trust the government is that it is the government. A skeptical people are a free people. Now, this theater piece is still in the third act. It's not an over and done with deal, and we have to keep on pushing. We have to keep on the call to keyboards. We have to keep on putting out there the sheer lunacy of this idea that Assad would invite in UN chemical weapons inspectors and launch a chemical attack right in front of them on the day they show up. And anything can still happen with this, because Israel, of course, is still pushing for this full-on war, get Syria, get Iran, do anything you can. Josh Bolton was all over Fox TV earlier today saying, no, you've got to go forward with this. We know that Assad did this. We've got to keep going. But the reality is right now today, the rush to war as economic cure-all in favor to Israel has hit a major pothole and torn out part of its suspension. So back to Floodgate. We're not going to fall for this distraction here. Now, in an effort to bolster the absolute loss of trust by the American people, remember, Washington, D.C. follows that old motto. If at first you don't succeed, lie, lie again. And today, Obama declassified the report they have that has the evidence that Assad had to do all of this. And again, the story that we got out of the Times of Israel is Washington will pursue limited assault against military targets. There's that word limited again. They're going to go in and blow some stuff up to look like they're doing something about Assad's chemical weapons, but they know that an outright war on Syria is a non-starter with the American people. Okay? Now, have you ever noticed that one of Israel's major downfalls is they don't know when to shut their mouth, because all over the Israeli media today, they are bragging and proclaiming how Obama's declassified report today is based on intelligence from Israel. Israel came up with the proof that Assad did this chemical attack, and they sent it to their good friends in Washington, D.C., so that Americans will go off and smite Israel's enemy. Israel's out there saying, we don't want to be involved in Syria's civil war. No, they want the Americans to go in and do it for them, because that's what the American kids are for. No, there's Israeli children there too precious to risk in a war on Israel's enemies. We just ship off the Americans. That's what they're there for. So we have these stories, Times of Israel. Israeli intelligence seen as central to the U.S. case against Syria. Let's see. Daily Caller, Israeli intelligence ties Syrian gas attack to Assad. Looking at another one here. Ynet News, report, Israel provided West evidence of Syrian chemical use. It's Israeli intelligence that has the goods here. Is this, refresh my memory here, would this be the same Israeli intelligence that told us all Saddam had nuclear weapons and that Egypt was attacking the USS Liberty? It's those same guys, right? By way of deception, thou shalt do war, sneak a radio transmitter into Tripoli, send out false messages, trick Reagan into bombing Gaddafi. Those guys, right? And so now they're out there proclaiming that they've got the goods on Assad, as if we would actually believe anything coming out of Israel and Israeli intelligence at this late date. And maybe this tendency for the government of the United States to think that the American people are all morons is a contagion they've picked up from the Israelis, who think that anybody who's not Israeli is a complete moron and can be lied to with impunity. All right, we're coming up on our first commercial break. I know we got a caller waiting on the line. We're going to get to you as soon as we come back from these words from our sponsors. Welcome back to our show. We're going to take a phone call here. Phil in Florida. Aloha, Phil. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the show. Syria is on my mind, and everything you said has been great. My concern is, regardless of what the American people know or not, these guys don't care. You know, they're going to go bomb another country. It's like Libya, you know, and without congressional declaration. I remember after Obama bombed the crap out of Libya, again, another bad guy turning on his people, same old story.
Yeah, how dare he sell Libya's oil for the gold dinar instead of the dollar? That man has got to go.
That's the translation, right? Obama did, when he said he consulted with Congress, Boehner said that doesn't even pass the straight face test, No, he didn't. And I talked to your producer there. What I wanted to mention was Congressman Walter Jones has had legislation for the past couple of years threatening impeachment should Obama do another Libya, bomb a country without congressional approval. Mm-hmm. And I've been in the organized anti-war movement with Veterans for Peace for years, and I am just disgusted with the anti-war movement for not grabbing on to these mechanisms that could actually prevent another war, because the guy has an R next to his name.
Well, let me first of all say that I think we should not blame the anti-war movement or the Occupy movement or whatever for failing to achieve change when we know this nation is completely corrupted by election fraud, and as you were saying before, the politicians aren't really listening to us. But two things have changed. Iraq, Afghanistan, all the way up to Libya, the American people just sort of went along with the flow and said, I don't agree with it, but I'm not going to do anything about it. Now the American people are very angry because the government rubbed their faces in an absolutely blatant, unbelievable lie and then stood back and said, if you're a patriotic American, you're going to believe this bovine excrement, and most people are digging in their heels. Now, next year is the midterm election, and Obama, as head of the Democratic Party, has to be understanding right about now, if he gets the U.S. into a war that 91% of Americans are absolutely opposed to right now, that it's going to basically hand the Congress back into GOP control. And he's got to be thinking about that. Ultimately, if this war moves forward, and we understand that in order to complete the dollarification program, they have to go into Syria, have to go into Iran. They're basically looking at long, drawn-out wars with Russia and China. And, when you had Pearl Harbor, which was also a war-starting hoax, we know now, the American people bought it, and they showed up at those military recruitment offices. This time, even though they're getting ready to enact a new draft bill, you're going to have American kids saying, I'm not going to go. You thought the draft resistance movement in Vietnam was strong. It's going to be nothing compared to America's resistance to a military draft now. And so I think that's another one of the reasons why they're looking for an exit strategy right now. The real wake-up call is that whatever they were planning on using as an excuse to go into Iran is probably not going to work. Because with the collapse of this lie about Assad and chemical weapons, they have to be, I hope, they tone down on the SSRIs, and they're realizing that these kind of deceptions and hoaxes simply do not work anymore in the 21st century. And how they may deal with that, I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the show.
Yes, I hear what you're saying, Mike, but we have to do everything we can, because this government, whatever it does, is in our name. And Republican, Democrat, they do answer to the money that funds them. And your film.
Well, I don't think that there's any way to work within the system at this point, because it is completely corrupt. But what Americans should be doing, and already the protests are organizing, they're already starting to organize, get out there in the streets and scream to the world, we don't believe the government's lies about Assad, we don't support this war, we're not going to pay for it, we're not going to fight in it, we will not accept responsibility for these war crimes. Because throughout history, when a government starts a war and loses, it's always the people who are expected to pay the costs. We're not going to do that. It's odious debt. This government wants to get into a war without our permission. Let them send their own kids. Let them open up their own wallets to pay for it. But we are not going to be part of it. And we're going to resist this war agenda any way we can by simply delinking from the system. We're not going to fill out the paperwork anymore. We're not going to pay the fees or whatever. We're just any way that we can to gum up the system, we're just going to have to do, and send that message to the rest of the world that this war agenda by the government in Washington, D.C. is not supported by the American people. And the polls are already showing that. They got only 9% on that one poll to agree to the war, and that 9% is accounted for by people getting federal government paychecks, working for defense contractors, people in the military, you know, who want to get promotion. If there's another war, I get promoted. And, you know, there was in the original movie of MASH an interesting line that flew past most people because the colonel who was in charge of the MASH unit always began his speeches with, "in the dark days before Pearl Harbor," and people didn't get what that was. And I got a chance to talk to the actor working on another movie, and he said the joke there was that before Pearl Harbor, nobody got promoted. Everybody was just sort of where they were in the military, and then after Pearl Harbor and there was a war, everybody was getting promotions. And so that's how the military is really thinking. And that basically, that's that 9% that says, yes, let's go into Syria, are the people who are going to get money and promotions and or sell bullets and bombs for that. But 91% of the American people do not agree with an intervention in Syria, even if this cock and bull story about Assad gassing women and children right in front of the inspectors, you know, were true, which, of course, it isn't. It's absurd.
Everything we can do to gum up the system, please add to that. Call your member of Congress and ask them to sign on with Walter Jones' HCR 3, which threatens impeachment should the president once again go to war without congressional approval. There are bipartisan co-sponsors.
Phil, I'm sorry, it's not going to work. This Congress does not have the spine to impeach Obama. Even if the House impeaches him, the Senate won't convict. Your energy is better spent going out and just proclaiming to the world, we don't support this, we're not going to be the wallets of last resort for Wall Street, we're not going to pay for the bullets and bombs that are being used to kill innocent people around the world. We're past the point where talking to Congress is going to accomplish anything. They're not, except for the NSA, they're not listening to us. I'm sorry, Phil. I'd love to see Obama impeached as an object lesson to future presidents. It's not going to happen. Not with this Congress firmly in the pockets of Wall Street and Israel. It's just not going to happen. I'm sorry. Phil, we're going to let you go and going to switch over quickly to Glenn in Sweden. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi. It's Glenn from Sweden. Great job you're doing there, Mike.
Thank you.
I want to say first, I don't believe that Assad gassed his own people, women and children, right in front of the UN Research Committee. And I wanted to ask a question specifically.
Yeah.
You're talking about a limited attack, and my problem with that is that could it be that those people playing global chess actually want to draw in both Syria and Iran and maybe even Russia into retaliating? How many times can a person living in a single-family dwelling allow thugs to come down the street and shoot potholes into their windows before they react?
Oh, well, listen, Glenn.
People will die. People will die.
Yeah, they will. Glenn, I have to take a break for commercials. When I come back, I'm going to lay out exactly why you're right and how it might play out for the Warhawks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. Now, the word out of Washington, D.C. is that Obama is considering 2 days of cruise missile strikes into Syria. They've issued a statement saying this is not about regime change. They are not trying to bring Assad down, unless he accidentally happens to be standing where one of those cruise missiles is aimed. And if we are going to take the White House at its word, a fantasy, but a pleasant one, then the only legitimate target of these cruise missiles would be Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles, which may not be very large at all. Any other military targets proves it is about regime change and reversing the disastrous recent losses of the hired mercenary army. And of course, if they hit any civilian targets, it's going to be a public relations disaster. But Glenn in Sweden is absolutely correct. The United States would love for Assad to shoot back. Now, out here in the real world, we understand when there are 4 warships launching cruise missiles into your country and killing far more Syrian people than are alleged to have died in this chemical weapons attack, Assad would be perfectly justified in trying to shoot those destroyers before they can launch any more cruise missiles. But of course, the position taken by the United States government would be, how dare he shoot at us while we're bombing his country? And the war would be up. He destroyed a ship here. And I'd like to remind everybody about that whole Pearl Harbor thing, how that came about. We know now that it was a setup. Roosevelt was following an 8-step plan crafted by Office of Naval Intelligence Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum to provoke Japan to attack, move the fleet to Pearl Harbor, all kinds of things they were doing to get Japan to attack. And Roosevelt had discussed as early as February of 1941 with the Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt's willingness to sacrifice several Navy ships to get the country into the war. And when the Japanese showed up here at Pearl Harbor, all the new modern ships, the carriers and their escorts, were out at sea, and what was left here in Pearl Harbor to be bombed by Japan were older ships that were pretty much at the end of their lifespan. The USS Iowa, the sister ship to the USS Arizona, had already been taken off combat status. It was being used for gunnery training. They left a bunch of old junk here to get blown up. Oh, those dastardly Japanese, they sunk 3 of our ships, which was the actual total losses in the attack on Pearl Harbor, were just 3 ships. Everything else was repaired and refloated. Contrast that with the Point Honda naval disaster off the coast of California, where they ran 9 battleships onto a reef in the fog. But here, I want to get back, and I want to make this point before Ryan Dawson's waiting on the line, and I'm going to get to you in just a second here, but I want to make a point. Obviously, those who want to push this war agenda forward would love for Syria to shoot back at the U.S. destroyers. They may not wait for Assad to do it. Now, we know that Israel has these Dolphin-class diesel-electric submarines from Germany. They're very quiet and very stealthy. They're much quieter than nuclear-powered submarines. We know they prowl the Mediterranean. They've been seen going through that Suez Canal. Germany has acknowledged, they have known for years, that Israel arms their cruise missiles on those Dolphin submarines with nuclear warheads. And I would not at all be surprised for Israel to sneak up on those U.S. ships, just as they're flinging cruise missiles onto Syria, and put a torpedo into one of them, or nuke the set of 4 and say, oh my God, Iran has just destroyed the ships. Remember the, whatever the name of the ship is, and we're off to war again. We cannot rule it out, because we have seen this kind of war-starting hoax before. Remember the Maine? Oh, dastardly Spanish mine blew it up in Havana Harbor. And that turned out to be a lie. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the father of America's nuclear navy, led an investigation down, examined the wreckage of the USS Maine, and confirmed Captain Sigsbee's report that the ship had blown up because of an onboard fire that set off an ammunition magazine. So Israel's the wild card here. They will do anything to make sure that young Americans go off to fight wars on Israel's enemies. All right, we're going to go to Ryan Dawson. Ryan, sorry to keep you waiting. What's on your mind?
Yeah, it's like Lusitania or the USS Liberty Part 2.
Yes, very, very much so.
The whole scenario.
And by the way,
it's like, oh, here come our ships. Hey, everybody, we're coming. We're sending our boat now. Don't hit it.
Yeah, how dare you shoot at us while we're shooting at you. Before I let you continue, though, for people who are not up on the story, the United States was drawn into World War I over the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship, and the Germans sank it because they had intelligence it was carrying war materials. Germany actually took out ads in the New York newspapers saying, do not sail on the Lusitania, it is a target of war and we will sink it. When the Lusitania sailed out, the Germans sunk it. Oh, they sunk this passenger ship full of innocent people, and off to war they went. Divers recently went down to the Lusitania, and they examined the cargo hold, and by golly, they found all kinds of war material in there, which made it a legitimate target of war. Those passengers on the Lusitania were set up to be sacrificed to get the U.S. into war. And again, going back and looking at how Roosevelt sacrificed all those people in Pearl Harbor to get us into World War II, it is not a stretch of imagination to consider that some elements within the U.S. government, and certainly within Israel, would not hesitate to sink one or all of those destroyers off the coast of Syria in order to inflame this war up further. Ryan, back to you.
Yeah, and the Liberty as well. They were sacrificial lambs.
Yes,
I mean,
they
Johnson
were.
was in on that. That was not an accident, and the cover-up has been ridiculous. This whole, I mean, Mike, thank you so much for all the coverage you've been doing on Syria in the past few weeks, especially. As you know, in Japan, I have to stay up till 3, 4 in the morning to even hear the show, and that's why I'm calling in today. I want people during the break or at some time to actually try calling Congress and telling them we don't want war and we don't want cruise missiles hitting Syria. Just try it. If they don't know the number, congress.org. Type in your zip code, get the number, and call them. And tell them, no. Do it. Everyone needs to do this. I mean, the chemical weapons myth is just... In Iraq, the Americans dropped white phosphorus all over Fallujah. They dumped Agent Orange and napalm all over Vietnam. The U.S. uses chemical weapons. So does Israel.
They use CS gas at that church in Waco, Texas. And, by the way, I'm going to back off what I was talking to Phil about. Go ahead and call your members of Congress. Call everybody. Call the local media. But get out there in the protests that are organizing against this thing. It may actually have an effect because, again, as I said, next year's the midterm election. And I just had a story cross my desk where apparently the congressional leaders are already calling the White House and saying you cannot carry out any strike against Syria without the approval of Congress. So apparently some of the members of Congress are digging in their heels, especially Democrats, because they know this is going to cost them a chance at re-election next year if this goes any further.
One guy that's being really vocal is Walter Jones from North Carolina. This Walter B. Jones Jr. Call all these people. I mean, so if your Congress critters happen to be like a McCain or some psychopath like that, maybe it really doesn't matter. But try it and fail, because that's better than not talking to them.
Yeah, and silence is our enemy right now. Just make as much noise as you can in any direction you can. Talking with your friends, your neighbors. Get out there with the protest. Get out there with the sign. Call your local media. Now's the time to get out there and scream in every single direction. No more wars for the bankers. No more wars for Israel. We are tired of this. We have a
dollar.
Yeah, it's all about the dollar. We have a government that's trying as hard as they can to be friends with Wall Street and friends with Israel. It is time for the U.S. government to worry about being friends with the American people. It really is.
Yeah, the price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men.
Absolutely.
That was Plato. And that's exactly how it is. And you've got to be proactive. This anti-war left that disappeared when Obama became president, you know, if you're still saying give him time, seriously, get over it. You need to be out there, and we need to be vocal, and not to let the NSA or any of these other stories off the hook, but this hot war with Syria, they want to hit them with Tomahawk missiles, and the way they've announced it, hey, we're coming in 2 days, this is crazy. Get out there now. And so at least, you know, if it fails, fine. But don't just post around on Facebook and talk to people online. It's not the critical thinkers we have to target. It's the sheep we have to target. You got to talk to people who get all their news from TV. That's the problem. That's who needs to be called, and that's who needs to be contacted.
Well,
thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan. And yeah, with apologies.
I work in the morning, but yeah.
With apologies to Phil in Florida, yeah, go ahead and call Congress. Call everybody. Call your local newspapers. Get out there in the block. It's a call to keyboards. Don't wait for orders. Just ride towards the sound or smell of bovine excrement and just make yourself heard. If you stay silent now, we're going to be in a full-blown global nuclear world war, and that's a bad day for everybody. We'll be back after these. Welcome back to the show. Now, earlier in the program, I was pulling out all these stories that are all over the Israeli media about how it is Israeli intelligence fed to the White House that forms the core of this accusation that Assad used chemical weapons on his own people right in front of the UN chemical weapons inspectors. The same Israeli intelligence that insisted Saddam had nuclear weapons and that Egypt was attacking the USS Liberty. And now we're looking at a story here out of vasiznius.com, where senior Israeli team in Washington, D.C. as U.S. prepares for possible Syria attack. National Security Advisor Susan Rice hosted a delegation led by Yaakov Amador, the chairman of Israel's National Security Council. Israel's proclaiming they don't want to have anything to do with Syria's war, but they're certainly over here telling the U.S. to go and do it. The U.S. has just announced they are no longer interested in seeking or acquiring authorization from either the United Nations or from NATO to strike Syria. This comes hard on the heels of Italy standing up and saying, no, you cannot do this. So basically, despite all this pretense about this is a coalition of the willing and we're going to, the U.S. is going to go it alone. And there is no provision in international law for one nation to attack another on the basis of anything that happens inside their borders. Nobody came in and bombed the United States after the U.S. government gassed that church full of women and children down in Waco, Texas. Nobody talked about cruise missile attacks into Washington, D.C. after that. They're just ginning this up out of thin air. Now the U.S. has completely abandoned even the pretense of this being a United Nations police action or a NATO operation. He can't get the support, except for France and Britain, which are always eager to go in for another war to serve the private central bankers, because all of those nations are slaves to private central bankers. So Obama's getting ready to unleash all those Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, which are capable of being armed with nuclear warheads. We don't know that that's the case, but we know the U.S. has a lot of them and reasons to use them, especially against hardened targets here. I'll give you an interesting little possibility that nobody seems to be thinking about. We know that Iran has perfected GPS spoofing. That's how they brought down that U.S. drone. And I don't think they've been idle ever since then. And it would actually, from a technological point of view, be very, very easy to construct a device to jam and spoof GPS and put it right next to an important military target. So that when those Tomahawk cruise missiles come in and they are guided by GPS, they sort of veer off to one side and go and hit an empty field someplace. If one of those Tomahawks hits a civilian target, it's all over for the United States. It's all over. They're screaming about innocent women and children being gassed by Assad. Well, what about innocent women and children being killed by U.S. drone strikes or Tomahawk cruise missiles? Don't they count? Or we want these bloody shirts to wave, but those bloody shirts over there, yeah, we can't talk about them over there. A lot of people are still pushing this whole idea that this is somehow a confrontation between Russia and the United States. How dare they take the other side? They say Russia and China set up warning over the strike. And yes, Russia and China have been diplomatically, politely sending very clear messages that this U.S. war for dollarification has gone as far as they're willing to let it go. Now, we may be getting some tough rhetoric out of Russia, or it may be tough rhetoric being made up and claimed to be Russia, but for those members of the Russian government who are listening to this radio show, I would advise toning it down a little tiny bit. Don't back off, don't quit. You're the only government that's acting like an adult right now in this planet full of children. But remember when Obama's bluff and bluster over Edward Snowden created this political situation where Russia couldn't send Snowden back without looking like it was following orders from Washington, D.C.? We're in a similar situation. I think Obama is looking for a graceful exit. A couple of cruise missile attacks, declare victory, and go home. He's already saying no regime change, no troops on the ground, so forth and so on. That whole chemical weapons story has failed. If Russia gets too tough in their warnings about Syria, Obama may feel he has to go ahead with a real war after all so that he does not look like he's taking orders from Moscow. This whole political situation is still a minefield, and we all need to take off our tap shoes if we're going to get through this with a minimum of bloodshed. Sadly, there will be bloodshed, because Obama is going to launch those cruise missiles. And he's going to kill more people than are alleged to have died in that chemical weapon attack here. All right, we're going to grab a phone call. Fred in Michigan. Aloha, Fred. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, Brother Mike, what you just described is treason in my book. Bombing a sovereign nation-state that doesn't have...
It's not treason. It's war. But it's unprovoked war against a country that has not attacked the United States of America. Syria hasn't done a thing to the United States of America other than to refuse to get tangled up in that whole international monetary fund thing. And by the way, Hungary just left the IMF. They're going back to state currencies and getting out of that whole debt cycle thing. I don't know how they're going to gin up war against Hungary, but I'm sure they're on the special high-interest targets list by now. Please go ahead.
Hey, to put an exclamation mark on what you said about Israel, I say, okay, when I call this Dingleman dude, who's a U.S. Congressman, John Dingle, he's been there longer than I've been on walking here, and then Carl the Vampire Levenstein, I'm going to demand that they take their 666 Star of David Israeli lobbyists, AIPAC and ADL, and they can boot them all out of the country, and they can take their frickin' UN with them too. And what do you think about that?
Well, again, we need to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that these wars are all caused by one agenda or one person or one group. They're not. There are multiple overlapping agendas, and when you have different groups with different interests and their interests overlap with the war, that's when the war is going to happen. From the private central bankers, it's all about forcing private central banking on the rest of the world. From the U.S. government's point of view, it's about forcing the world back to Bretton Woods and the petrodollar. From Israel's point of view, it's about smashing up potential political rivalries in the Mideast and maintaining their dominion over that part of the world. For the oil companies, it's about access to oil, and on and on and on and on. There are dozens and dozens of different overlapping agendas behind these wars, and I don't want to focus on any one group because it allows the others to sort of get away with their plausible deniability.
Well, we need to go back. Can't we somehow raise the conscience of the American people to the understanding that if Abraham Lincoln did it, JFK was doing it, that's what we need to do. We need U.S. Treasury notes, not Federal Reserve notes. Those clowns need to be booted out of the country.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do. But every time this nation tried to boot them out, war got declared by another nation where those people are holding power. Now, the opportunity that presents itself at our current stage in history is it is entirely possible this private central banking is going to come down all at once all across the globe. And if it does, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for every single nation to say, okay, failed experiment, doesn't work, we're going to go back to government-issued value-based currencies, the public currency is a public utility, no more private central banking. We can't allow any private central bank in any country, or they'll start the whole scam all over again.
Yeah, Semper Fi, brother. Carry on.
Thank you very much. All righty, let's see. The U.S. State Department has indefinitely postponed a meeting with Russia regarding Syria. And the reason for that is simple. The U.S. was going to ask Russia to stop supporting Syria. Russia's going to say no. Why bother having a meeting? We'll be right back after Phyllis Schlafly. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're still talking about this attempt to sell a war in Syria as the final stepping stone before the long-lusted-for war with Iran, and obviously the war machine is in serious, serious trouble. As I mentioned last segment, we're getting a story. Leaders of the U.S. Congress are sending messages to Obama. He cannot authorize a strike into Syria without congressional approval. Now, under the War Powers Act, the President can deploy U.S. military forces to deal with a threat to the United States. But Syria is not threatening the United States of America, so they're trying to gin that up. Talk about that in a little bit. Apparently, members of Parliament are telling David Cameron that he cannot join in an attack on Syria without the approval of Parliament. So Cameron's calling Parliament back from recess for a vote. It is not a guarantee he will get that either. Cameron and Obama are trying to find some way to legitimize what is clearly an unprovoked attack on a foreign nation. And the U.S. has abandoned trying to get United Nations approval because they know it'll never get past either Russia or China at the Security Council. They were trying to say it's a NATO operation. Most of NATO is ducking out of this. It's really coming down to France, Britain, and the U.S. as the new Axis powers, waging war on the world for the rise of private central banking. And, of course, the only adult in this room full of children continues to be Russia, which has made their position very, very clear. They are not going to allow this campaign to force the world back onto Bretton Woods to go any further. And there's a lot of wheeling and dealing and stuff going on in the back channel. It's beginning to surface. We had this story a while back over at the Telegraph. The Saudis offer Russia secret oil deal if it drops Syria. And the Saudis were going to just give Russia this huge deal that would allow them to actually control the global oil market and safeguard Russia's gas contracts if they would simply stop supporting Syria. Russia turned them down. And the Saudis came back with another offer. This one was reported over at 21st Century Wire, a second attempt to bribe Russia to drop their support of Syria. Russia doesn't need Saudi Arabia's money. Saudi Arabia's money is mostly the U.S. dollar, which is rapidly evaporating in terms of any real value. Putin has the Russian economy ticking along just fine ever since he took control of Russia's central bank. And he has no desire to be seen as someone who has a price, who can be bought. Good reason to admire the guy. And now we're getting this story, this just broke over at INFOWARS.com, where apparently Saudi intelligence has issued a threat to Putin that unless he abandons support for Syria, there will be terrorist attacks at the Moscow Olympics, or the Russian Olympics. And apparently that has now gone public. Now the Saudis have always been hand in glove with U.S. policy in the region because it has always profited them handsomely. Their part of the petrodollar deal is they get all these dollars pouring in from around the world for their oil, which they invest in U.S. real estate, they invest in U.S. treasuries. Good luck getting those paid off. And they're always there in the Middle East helping the U.S. policy along here. But the Saudis need to take a good look at Syria, because the United States made all kinds of promises to those hired mercenaries who, in addition to their very lucrative paychecks, were fighting against Assad on the promise they would be the new incoming government of Syria. And now that the U.S. is trying to transition to an outright military invasion, the U.S. has just cut them all off. It's disavowed them now, formally, officially. And the same is going to be true for Saudi Arabia. This United States government, clearly dominated by Israel, will turn on Saudi Arabia as soon as Saudi Arabia is no longer useful to them, because they've done it to every other country in history. As long as you serve the U.S. in its interests, oh yes, we're good friends here, and as soon as you're no longer useful, goodbye. And the Saudis have a lot of wealth and influence, but they're not really thinking clearly about the dangerous game they are playing, because the U.S. has built them up as a regional power to use them, and the moment they're no longer useful, the U.S. will tear Saudi Arabia down. As I mentioned earlier in the show, Italy has ruled out any action in Syria without United Nations approval, and that's not going to happen. Now, I want to talk about those UN inspectors, because there's a lot of funny things going on with them. Reuters is out there actually proclaiming the U.S. is going to strike Syria before the United Nations chemical weapons inspectors finish collecting their evidence. The Russians are, we don't need evidence. We already know it's Assad. Israel told us it was Assad. We believe and trust Israel, even though they lied to us about the Levant affair, and lied to us about Libya, and lied to us about the USS Liberty, and lied to us about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. But despite all of this, we believe that Israel is telling us the truth, and we're going to go on and strike Assad. Now, a lot of chemical weapons experts are expressing doubt about this story, and well that they should, and for the same reason that I did. Remember when I said the fastest way to find the truth of a matter is to look for what should be there and is not. And Dan Cazzetta, former officer in the U.S. Army's Chemical Corps, is saying exactly the same thing I did. If these people had been gassed with sarin gas, the people trying to help them would be contaminated and poisoned by it as well. They should be wearing biosafety suits, protective gear, and they're not. And it just doesn't make any sense that we're talking about sarin here. Syria is out there saying that the United States actually has no evidence that Syria used chemical weapons because Syria didn't do it. Meanwhile, we had all those flashback stories that we've been reporting over yesterday about all the times the rebels were caught with sarin and chlorine and all this other stuff. And everybody is pointing back and saying, remember how the U.S. lied to its people and the world about Saddam's nuclear weapons. They're doing it again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And the U.S. government actually thought you, the American people, were stupid enough to fall for the same lie twice in a row. And thank you for proving them wrong on that one. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. Remember when the inspectors first went out to the site to gather samples, there was a sniper attack. They had to go back to the hotel where there was a mortar attack. And this was after the UN itself had delayed the inspectors leaving out of safety concerns. Yeah, snipers and stuff going on. But we know who doesn't want any actual investigation here. The U.S. is already saying, oh, it's too late. It's too late for inspectors. The evidence is gone, and, you know, we don't need the inspectors. The United States called on the United Nations to withdraw the inspectors from Syria. Get them out of there, is what they said. The United Nations said no. And almost immediately, the UN inspectors came again under sniper fire. At which point the United Nations said, yeah, we're going to call off the inspections and get the inspectors out of there. Gee, somebody really didn't want them there. Even Rachel Maddow is out there asking, why are we attacking Syria before the UN weapons inspectors actually finish their job? And that's a valid question. Well, obviously, what the inspectors are going to find doesn't support the official story. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. Unlike last May, where the UN inspectors went in to find chemical weapons and who used them and concluded the rebels had done it, this time, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that the inspectors are only there to determine whether chemical weapons were used at all, but they are forbidden from finding out who used them. They just want decision support for the war in Syria, and they're literally told, don't look for who did it. It doesn't get more obvious than that. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to grab a phone call here. Keith in Montana. Aloha, Keith. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hello, Mike. Hey, you know, I was thinking there, Mike, this NSA thing is going to backfire on this UN deal here, because I've been reading story after story about how the UN is just totally peeved at this spying.
Yeah, that's why that's why the White House just said they're not going to seek UN approval. And talk about a backlash. You know, it has come back on them. And that's probably the reason NATO's backing off of this, is because the NSA was spying on all the NATO countries.
Yeah, one of these articles goes on to talk about how they broke into their teleconferencing and everything like that, and then it went from just 12 instances up to 58. And so you can, you know, you would think that if the UN is carrying little cell phones around like that right now, they're totally off and the battery's out.
Well, and even then I wouldn't be sure about it. I mean, this stuff is also backdoored. I mean, if I have a need to be private, and fortunately I don't have very many of those, you know, I've got this wonderful case from Privacy Case. You put the phone in that, it's completely isolated from the rest of the world.
Yeah. But I do think there's some merit to that there, because if you read the stories about how the UN says they're going to deal with this when they get back, so apparently this is a big issue to them.
Oh, yeah, well, it's a big issue to everybody. You know, this was all supposed to be about finding criminals and finding terrorists, and then we find out they're using the system to stalk their ex-girlfriends or go after romantic rivals to find some dirt on them. Yeah, we're all angry about this, and I'm not surprised the United Nations is angry about it. And payback is definitely, you know, being seen here in the lack of enthusiasm at the United Nations or NATO for yet another U.S. military intervention. So, yeah, it's all coming back on them right now.
Yeah, I think it's good blowback. So that's all I wanted to say. I hope you and the wife have a good one, okay?
All right, thanks an awful lot, and you raise a good point. The inability of the United States to form this coalition of the willing for yet another war based on a lie is probably in big part blowback from all this NSA spying on everybody here. Now, getting back over to Syria, and I know we're spending most of the show on it, and obviously this is a crisis point. If we don't stop this thing dead in its tracks, you know, that we're going to be in a nuclear world war. Syria is accusing John Kerry of lying and disregarding the United Nations inspectors, which is a study in foregone conclusions, because that's exactly what he's doing. John Kerry had his Colin Powell moment yesterday. We all remember when Colin Powell was out there at the United Nations for 2 hours with his little glass tube of anthrax. And then after he was out of public service, Colin Powell basically went public saying, yeah, he was told a lie. And looking at John Kerry's face when he was making his presentation, it was obvious he was not entirely comfortable about what he was ordered to say here. China has basically come out saying, we're not listening to what you say about Syria because we remember what you said about Iraq. And everybody does. The United States government lied to the world. Israel helped. A lot of that information came from Israel about Saddam had nuclear weapons. They was going to nuke everybody. Didn't happen. And we all need to go back and remember how we were all lied to get us into that war, and we're being lied to again to get us into this war. Another article, this is over at the Telegraph, saying, why would Assad invite a Western intervention by using chemical weapons in a war he was already winning conventionally? And the answer, of course he wouldn't do that. Another flashback story surfaced. Turkey finds sarin gas in homes of suspected Syrian Islamists. This was reported over there in Russia Today. The evidence is overwhelming. The hired mercenaries had the chemical weapons. Last May, the United Nations concluded they were the ones using them. And of course, the United States really doesn't have any moral authority to scream about chemical weapons because the U.S. has used them. White phosphorus in Fallujah, CS gas in Waco, Texas. And documents have been recently declassified that the Central Intelligence Agency helped Saddam Hussein carry out chemical weapons attacks on Iran and knew that's what he was doing. The CIA's official line up until now is, well, we just gave him intelligence information. We had no idea he was going to use chemical weapons. And now documents have surfaced saying that, yeah, they knew that it was exactly what he was going to do. So the U.S. does not have the moral authority to scream about anybody else's use of chemical weapons. Little reminder that General Wesley Clark blew the whistle on this petrodollar Bretton Woods campaign of war and said that this all goes back to 2001 when it was all kicked off with 9/11, which we know was also another fraud, another hoax. And he says he was shown a memo listing all the countries to be conquered over the period of the next 5 years, ending with Iran, to take control of the oil-rich nations of the earth and make sure they only ever sold their oil for the U.S. dollar. And you need to go back and look at that. He's actually on video. There's a YouTube video of him telling the story here. As I mentioned earlier in the show, all kinds of protests are starting to organize. We have one here, apparently Downing Street tomorrow night. There's going to be a massive protest out in front of there. And you should be in the streets right now. Everyone should be in the streets glaring through the windows of the war hawks right now. It is clear that some elements of the U.S. government are faltering in this rush to war. I think Obama is looking for a graceful exit to get out of this mess he's created. They're going to send some cruise missiles in, declare moral victory, and go home. But they're already saying it's not regime change, we're not invading. Unless, of course, Syria shoots back, which is the wild card, as I mentioned before. And again, something we ought to be very much on the lookout for is Israel, of course, wants America to go into Syria and go into Iran and smash them all up. You know, remember, there's a very close association, politically, religiously, and economically, between the nation of Israel and these private central banks. They're all buddy, 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 buddy. And knowing how Israel likes to try and sink U.S. ships and blame other people for them, USS Liberty, USS Cole, we should expect that Israel will be at least considering a plan to send a Dolphin-class submarine up to where those 4 U.S. destroyers are flinging cruise missiles at Syria and try and sink one, to blame it on Syria. Israel could use a nuclear weapon, which we know they have, and we know are carried and deployed off of those Dolphin-class submarines, to sink all 4 of the ships in order to drag Iran in. Because there's one very clear fact that we need to realize, or at least the government needs to realize. They're not going to be able to come up with a story about WMDs or oppressing the people or bringing democracy or terror that is going to sell a war with Iran to the American people. So the only way they're going to get their war with Iran is to make it look like Iran has inflicted an unjustified military strike on U.S. assets. Just like what Roosevelt did at Pearl Harbor, they could very well consider doing to these 4 U.S. destroyers sitting off the coast of Syria right now. Alrighty, we've talked about Syria enough. We're about halfway through the program here. As you're probably already aware, one of the reasons for Obama to try and launch a war somewhere besides distracting us all from Floodgate is the fact that the U.S. government has hit its debt ceiling, or is about to. The Treasury chief is saying that the debt ceiling will be hit in mid-October. So hit the debt ceiling, start a war. We know this is probably bogus, because for the last 100 days, the Treasury website has been showing the U.S. government debt as pretty much frozen just below the current ceiling. So I think they're already over the debt ceiling. Now they know we know. Now they got to come back and raise the borrowing limit yet again. They can't fix the problem. They're in too deep. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show. And possibly because of the concern that a U.S. attack on Syria is going to inflame the entire region, which is a very, very real possibility. John Kerry's comments about Syria yesterday triggered a sharp drop in the stock market that's gone around the globe, and it's a bad day on the American stock markets as well. The Dow's down about 170 right now. Because if the whole region goes up, there's going to be an oil shortage, fuel costs are going to go right through the roof, and so many businesses, especially here in the United States of America, are hovering on the edge of collapse right now. Any major increase in energy costs is going to put them under. Now, over in the Eurozone, Dijsselbloem, who heads the Eurogroup of finance ministers, is out there telling the local newspapers that Greece will need a 3rd bailout. Gee, we've given them 2 bailouts. It just doesn't seem to work. Well, all a bailout is plunging them deeper and deeper into debt and not giving them the means to get out of that debt, because that is the way private central banking works. By design, it creates more debt than money with which to pay that debt. Now, they're propping up Greece. They're propping up the entire Eurozone to save Wall Street from $90 trillion in credit default swaps they sold against Europe's debt. And Wall Street doesn't have the cash reserves to make good on those credit default swaps. So they're going to go on bailing out Greece and bailing out Greece. And they're always talking about economic reforms, which means cut spending to the people in order to give it to the bankers. But it doesn't work. The spreadsheet on which the austerity model was based had a mistake that nobody caught before it was used to set fiscal policy. And all these public workers that are being let go by the government to control their spending do not have private sector jobs to go to. So the tax revenues continue to fall, dependency on social services for food and everything continue to go up. A 3rd bailout will not solve the problem. Private central banking has to go. Every nation on earth enslaved to a private central bank issuing that public currency as a loan at interest is mired in trillions and trillions of unpayable debt. It can never, ever be paid off. That's the trap. That's the enslavement. It is the essence of the banking industry to keep us all, whether we are nations or individuals, slaves to debt to be controlled. Greece does not need another rescue. They need a way out. You can look at that whole Eurozone and picture it as a boat sitting in the water. There are 10 holes in the bottom of that boat, and there's only 9 corks. And everything they're trying to do to save the economy in Europe amounts to pulling a cork out of one hole, pounding it into another hole in full view of the press cameras while screaming, "I'm working on the problem," and the boat continues to sink. And until somebody comes up with a way to provide more corks without having to take them out of somebody else's hole, you're not going to solve the problems. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the show, Hungary is going through a financial change. They're basically delinking from the International Monetary Fund. They're shutting down their private central bank. In fact, there's already analogies being made to what Hungary is doing right now and what Germany did in the 1930s. Kiss off that private central bank and go to a government-issued, value-based currency that works for the people. Public currency is public utility. So Hungary just made the special high-interest targets list. I don't know how they're going to come up with an excuse to invade Hungary. Al-Qaeda's in there. They have nuclear bombs. They hate us for our freedoms. They're oppressing their people. We must go in and teach Hungary a lesson about running an economy without private central banking. Meanwhile, the EU is facing more and more resistance. As you're probably already aware, Iceland has put the kibosh on joining the EU. Now up in Norway, 7 out of 10 Norwegians are saying no. They're having a referendum about joining the European Union, and they're saying, no, it's going to go down to a major, major defeat. Norway doesn't want to become the new Germany, whose economic productivity is being siphoned off to deal with the debts of the other European Union countries, and all because they are all slaves to that European Central Bank, which by design creates more debt than money with which to pay that debt. It is the inevitable result of that system of banking. This country, the United States, we fought a revolution to be free of that kind of banking. Only to have our government sell us back into the slavery of that same system, not once but 3 times. With the first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, and they were going to call it the Third Bank of the United States, but they realized they needed rebranding, and so they called it the Federal Reserve to make it sound like it's part of the government, but it isn't. It's no more federal than Federal Express. It is a private central bank and a bunch of private bankers who have seized control of the public's currency and turned it into a private for-profit venture. Now, if you've been looking on TV at all these so-called payday lenders, you probably noticed the extraordinarily high triple-digit interest they're charging. It's basically legalized loan sharking, although it turns out it's not really all that legal. Western Sky Financial, which has been doing their thing online and on TV, is going to have to shut down because they're fighting mounting legal battles with several states, including Maryland, and they just announced that as of September 3rd, they will cease to do business. When the people are suffering in a bad economy, is not the time to engage in more predations. Like I said earlier in the show, we have a government that's working as hard as they can to be friends with Wall Street and friends with Israel. The time has come for the United States government to worry about being friends with the American people. Because when the American people just quit, sit down and say, I'm not going to work, I'm not going to contribute to the system any longer, it's all going to fall apart. There's an institutional blindness on Wall Street that they can all get rich and completely ignore ordinary Americans whose labor is the true source of wealth in this country. By the way, speaking of hard times, apparently the cost of Amy Goodman's radio show, Democracy Now!, has driven WBAI deeply into debt, and they're cutting 2/3 of their staff to deal with those losses, which is a reminder, by the way, that we here at Republic Broadcasting and WhatReallyHappened.com are totally dependent on you, the readers and listeners, to keep going. Now, fortunately, we don't have the high overhead of an Amy Goodman, but neither are we getting huge advertising checks from companies like Monsanto for some strange reason. They're not returning our phone calls. And so we rely on you. So if you have a chance, if you haven't donated yet, and thank you to those who have, get on over to the webpage, hit that donate button, because we need your help to keep going. The corporations are spending millions of dollars to lie to you. Israel is spending millions of dollars to lie to you. They're hiring students to go out on the net and prowl around and say, Israel is great, and everybody else is an anti-Semite. We need your help to keep on telling you the truth here. All right, we're going to grab a quick phone call here. Jim in Kansas. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I keep hearing about Federal Express and the Fed not being related to each other. But
that's not what I said. That's not what I said. I said the Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. They're not part of the government just because they have the name Federal in there. There's other companies, Federal Delivery, Federal Pizza. You know, they just use the name.
Well, I would like to point out that the founder of Federal Express was a member of Skull and Bones.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, you know, they're in positions of power all over the nation, and there's a very strong tie between Skull and Bones and the Central Intelligence Agency. But the point I was making is when they renamed the Third Bank of the United States to the Federal Reserve, it was only to fool ordinary Americans into thinking that it was still a government-issued, government-managed currency, and it isn't. And it absolutely isn't. So we're going to let you go, Jim. Thank you very much. I'm reading multiple things here. I just got a text here. Janet Napolitano's farewell speech included a warning about a potential massive cyber attack here in the United States. Remember what we said about the virtual 911? When they can't keep the economy going any longer, the U.S. government will crash all the financial system computers and claim it's a terror attack so they can duck the responsibility for having wrecked the place through decades of crime and corruption and Wall Street fraud. So Napolitano is out there selling this idea. All right, we got to take another break for some commercials here. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. America, welcome back to the show here. Story just coming out of CBS right now. The Secretary General of NATO, not the United Nations, but of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, has basically put the kibosh on NATO going into Syria. He says there's no direct military role in Syria for the NATO alliance and warns against stepped-up Western military involvement. He's warning of unpredictable regional repercussions. This is why the White House came out with that statement earlier today saying they're not concerned about getting UN or NATO approval to go into Syria because clearly they knew it wasn't going to happen. So now you've got the United Nations isn't going to support this invasion or this attack on Syria. You've got NATO that is saying, no, we're not going to do this. So it's all back down to the United States preparing to launch cruise missiles. And, of course, behind the U.S. government, you've got Israel with a bullwhip saying, get them, get them, get them, get them. And even after Syria, they still have the problem. How do they sell a war with Iran knowing that nobody is going to buy any more stories about weapons of mass destruction? Nobody's going to believe any more stories about they're repressing their people cruelly. Nobody's going to believe any more stories about we're bringing democracy to the region. They hate us for our freedoms and all this other stuff they've been saying all along. They tried a covert overthrow in Iran in 2009. It fell flat on its face. So right now, the only way the war hawks can get war with Syria and Iran going is with a 2-for-1 deal. And that is why I am very concerned that when these destroyers start launching their cruise missiles into Syria, that somebody will attack the destroyers and blame Syria and Iran for it. And the best way to be able to blame Iran for it is to use a nuclear weapon. Now, these 4 destroyers that are currently off the coast of Syria are the USS Gravely, the USS Mahan, the USS Barry, and the USS Ramage. They're all based out of Norfolk, Virginia. USS Gravely is on its maiden deployment, brand new ship. First time overseas for much of the crew. Remember the Gravely. Especially because we remember the Maine, what a lie that was. We remember Pearl Harbor and what a lie that was. The people who want these wars to move forward, the war to force Bretton Woods back on the rest of the world to support the petrodollar, they are desperate. All the tricks that used to work don't work any longer. And if you, the listener, know anybody in the crew on any of these ships, do me a favor and shoot them an email and say, just keep an eye out for any Israeli submarines lurking around you. And remember what happened to the USS Liberty. Because Israel has a track record of trying to sink U.S. ships and blaming other people for them. Did it with the USS Liberty, tried to frame Egypt, did it with the USS Cole, framed Yemen for it. It's pretty much their only option left. Now, we've been talking about the so-called peace talks between Israel and Palestine, and how after grandstanding over there, John Kerry, we're here to be the impartial, objective arbiters between the two sides, and then of course Israel refused to allow the U.S. representatives even into the talks. So it was a room full of Israelis screaming at the Palestinians. And apparently Israel has attacked a Palestinian refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. At which point the Palestinians said there really isn't much point in our discussing peace with you when you're killing our people. Which, of course, is exactly what Israel wants, because they play this game over and over and over again. Yes, we welcome peace talks. Please come in, agree to what we want first. Maybe we'll give you something nice in return. And then they go out and start new housing starts in the occupied territories. They carry out this attack on the Palestinian refugee camp. So the Palestinians realize the Israelis are not negotiating in good faith and leave. Now Israel's going to say, we tried to have peace talks. The Palestinians left. That's all their fault. The talks fell apart. Meanwhile, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency has announced that one of the people killed in this raid on the refugee camp was one of their staffers. A United Nations staff member was shot by Israeli forces. 34-year-old guy, father of 4. Meanwhile, apparently there's a Catholic monastery in Israel that was hit with a firebomb by Jewish extremists. And I point that out for all the people in this country who call themselves Christian Zionists, who are so supportive of Israel because of all that end times nonsense, which, by the way, isn't in the original Bible. And this whole idea that if they help Israel set fire to planet Earth, that after it's all over, Jesus is going to come down and invite them all up to the big house and just give them a big, warm, fuzzy hug. Because Israel takes advantage of Christians in this country for propaganda and political reasons, but they don't return the favor. There is no respect coming back the other way. And you need to wake up and realize that you're being used. Now, a while back, there was a scandal at Oberlin College involving some highly racist flyers that were posted all over. Oh, they're racist, they're this and that. And they finally caught the culprit. And it turns out it was a supporter of Barack Obama who is saying that he was putting the racist posters up there to stir the pot, to make racism an issue. Because we know that when Obama wants us to look away from NSA Gate, EPA Gate, Benghazi Gate, all the rest of that, he wanted racism an issue. That's why the Department of Justice was literally financially supporting and promoting all those protests against George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case, and how the whole media the week ahead said, when Zimmerman's acquitted, there'll be race riots across the country. And it didn't happen because everybody, black, white, young, old, male, female, gay, straight, peach, taupe, and mauve, understood it was a setup to get race riots, to declare a national emergency, to take the heat and focus off all the scandals around Obama. By the way, speaking of drones, you know, we had a U.S. military drone crash on a highway not too long ago. Now one of the private drones apparently crashed into a crowd in Virginia at some kind of a concert, injuring 5 people because, you know, those rotors out on the end of the drones, there's no ducting, there's no shroud. They're like spinning knives. And this thing fell into the crowd and apparently julienned up a couple of people. It's only going to take a few more of those before somebody's going to have to say, we don't care if the police want to peek into our bedroom when I'm making love to my wife. There have got to be rules about these things. They're dangerous. They're falling out of the skies. And it's not just the private drones. The U.S. government has dumped a bunch of these things into the ground. Now, getting on into the environmental wackos and pushing their electric cars here, apparently the Franklin Avenue Public Library spent $16,000 to build electric car charging stations at the library. And it turns out they were used a grand total of 13 times over a period of 15 months. They're not even being used once per month. And apparently they thought this was going to be a huge revenue generator because the library gets $1 every time they're used. So the library spent $16,000 and they got $13 back on that investment. There's some good planning for you. And by the way, for all of you who love electric cars, and by the way, hybrids are good. I think hybrids are very, very good. But these all-electric cars, they plug them in and they say, it's great, we're environmentally friendly. No, you're not. Where do you think that electricity is coming from? Oil and coal-fired power plants for the most part, or nuclear plants that are leaking all over the place. By the way, that Yankee plant up in Vermont is going to be shut down now because it can't be maintained anymore. You're not getting rid of pollution by using an electric car. You're just moving the pollution and the carbon emissions someplace else. That's all you're really doing. And you lose efficiency with every energy conversion along the way. Now here's a really good one. Owing to budget cuts, the U.S. government is planning to shut down a turtle or tortoise conservation center. They can't afford to have this conservation center for these tortoises any longer, and they're going to kill the tortoises. What was the whole point of having this conservation center anyway? Can't you find zoos or sell them as pets? You're just going to go in there and just cut these tortoises because they are out of money. They're going to do that to we the people when they run out of money for food stamps. Just go out and gun them down. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show. We're going to grab a phone call here. Paul in Michigan. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Aloha, Michael. I do agree with you about this. My call is about allocation of fuels for various modes of transportation. Mm-hmm. But I do see why a car in the future, 50 years from now, when we start really running low on fuel, I do see why cars should run on electric batteries, because an airplane cannot run on coal, but a car can. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. This is why the finest fuels are made for the tanks and the battleships and the airplanes and such. And ultimately, I would see electric cars as a good way to go, as long as you had a way of generating that electricity that was environmentally friendly. But we know that fission-type nuclear reactors are very dangerous, as Fukushima, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island have already proved. Again, if the United States government had taken all this money they've poured all over Wall Street to save them from the collapse of the mortgage-backed security fraud, and instead spent it on infrastructure, we could have purchased thorium cycle electric power stations for 30 American cities. And that would have definitely been a turning point around. Something else they may want to do is go out to some of those platforms out there in the oil, in the Gulf of Mexico or off the coast of California, stop drilling for oil and stop fracking, and start working on bringing around true fusion power. Now, the Chinese have already done it. They've achieved break-even on their hot fusion reactors. And you could use that to simply suck up water, use electrolysis to split it into hydrogen and oxygen, just let the oxygen up into the atmosphere, and use the hydrogen as a fuel source, which would be powerful enough to fuel airplanes in the air. And what do you get when you're burning hydrogen in an internal combustion engine? You get water vapor. So, there are all kinds of ways to solve the problem. What is lacking is the political will and the financing to do it, because those large corporations that have grown up around these older technologies, coal and oil and nuclear, have, through their money power, they want to perpetuate staying right at that level of civilization. Large corporations and government don't want to advance and improve civilization. They like things just the way they are right now until there's a massive breakdown, and it's at that point you start to see the opening opportunities for completely redesigning some of this stuff. If you go back and you look at history, you usually have to see a societal breakdown where that old infrastructure and that old money power goes away and opens up the opportunity to develop new things.
That makes sense. One last quick question. What do you think about some of these technologies I've read about with vegetable and, waste vegetable, waste animal fats that you can use for fuel? Do you think that ever has a future?
Of course it has a future. I mean, the diesel engine was actually originally developed to run on vegetable oil. And the only reason they went to a special diesel fuel was because financial interests that had the refineries to make the special diesel fuel were tied in with the same bankers who were financing World War II. And they literally did this deal saying, we will finance World War II as long as you only buy tanks and jeeps and stuff that run on our special diesel fuel. The guy who invented the diesel engine was trying to get into that debate, but he met with a very strange, suspicious death before he could get there. But yeah, biodiesel does in fact work. Again, it takes the political will and the infrastructure to develop it as a true alternative source. But the oil companies don't want that. The oil companies like things just the way they are. They love their fracking, even though that's beginning to hit on some hard times across the country. There's really a huge amount of political and financial pressure against looking for efficient, large-scale alternative sources of energy, because the technology is out there, just there's no investment in it, because it's too upsetting to the owners of the oil wells and the oil tankers and the giant refineries. And that's really what it comes down to. We're not a progressive society, despite political propaganda to the contrary. We are a society very much trying to stay in the 1950s and 1960s, politically, economically, energy, infrastructure-wise. Again, following a major social economic upheaval, there are going to be opportunities to say, all right, let's step back and see if there are better ways to accomplish what we've been doing than simply going along with what worked before. Because I agree, even though I understand that new petroleum is in fact still being formed in the Earth's crust by microbes, we are burning it up faster than those little microbes can replenish it. And we should be moving on to thorium cycle reactors, to hot fusion power. I know the U.S. military labs are actually getting success with cold fusion. There's a lot of stuff out there that's ready to be developed once the money and political influence of the large existing corporations is no longer able to keep it clamped down.
Yeah, it looks like the third world, or some of the second world countries, are probably going to lead the field in that regard.
I would agree. I would agree. America's unfortunately paralyzed by a great deal of its previous industrial success because the owners of that infrastructure don't want to write it off. They don't want to tear it down. And that's why throughout history you'll see this civilization rise and develop all kinds of really cool things. Then they sort of fossilize over, and someplace over here another newer civilization arises with newer technology until they fossilize over. And it's sort of that's why the centers of power and commerce and civilization bounce around the planet all the time.
Yeah, great points. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Michael.
All right, you got it. Now, bye-bye. Interestingly enough, guy by the name of Dr. Charles Arntzen, who is the head of the Biodesign Institute for Infectious Diseases and Vaccinology, and is a big supporter of edible vaccines. Here, eat this candy, you'll be fine. I don't think so. Is basically out there promoting the idea of engineered bioweapons to reduce the human population, or forced starvation. And by the way, forced starvation is a very, very painful way to die. Now, I am of the opinion that were humanity spread all across the face of the globe uniformly and not being corralled into these large ranches called cities for the convenience of the tax collectors and the military draft people, that Earth can in fact support the current human population and a little bit larger. Should we trim back the human population? Maybe. The question is who gets to do it. And I get very, very angry with people like Dr. Arntzen saying we should go kill off these other people with an engineered virus to do it. Now, if you think the human population is too large, and you may be right, you're invited to climb to the top of the nearest cliff and jump off. Or if you want, voluntarily sterilize yourself. Because while I agree there's a lot of crowding going on here, I'm sick and tired of all these population control freaks running around wanting to solve the problem by having other people die off. Or other people go without children. And by the way, I think there is a population control function built into the human race. It's called homosexuality. Because if you study the situation very closely, you will find that the per capita incidence of homosexuality increases in locations of social stress. And far from being a sin or wrong or all the rest of that stuff, I think the human population actually does have a tendency to limit its own population when things get a little bit too crowded. Now, unfortunately, it tends to be a little too crowded before that mechanism kicks in. But I get really tired of people just, with these academic credentials and gold things on the wall and huge amounts of funding saying, oh yeah, let's engineer a virus like contagion and just wipe out 1/3 of the population. And I know they think like that because they look back at the Great Plagues of Europe, which wiped out 25 to 30% of the population, and along with the medieval warming period, triggered the Renaissance. Wouldn't it be fun to be in a Renaissance? We just have to get rid of 1/3 of the people. Well, what if you're part of that 1/3? Me? No, I'm not going. Anyway. All right, we're coming up here on another commercial break. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Call on in. I'm going to be dragging this back to Syria before the end of the show. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And I was talking about how civilizations, after they've achieved a certain degree of success, they sort of fossilize over. They've got an infrastructure or a social structure, political structure, and they think that's fine, and we don't want to move forward, we don't want to change anything. And that is why eventually they sort of fade away. And I think the United States definitely qualifies as that. We're not very forward-looking. We're too busy pumping money into Wall Street and declaring war on the rest of the world to actually look into the future and see the potential that's out there. I think this is why back on the Viking mission, when the raw data from the labeled release experiment said we'd found indigenous life on Mars, NASA was under a great deal of pressure to say no, and they relied on the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer results, which we now know was a false negative. There was a design flaw in the experiment. It couldn't have worked. But I think from the U.S. government's point of view, the last thing they want right now is for the American people to be told for a fact that we know there is life out there in the universe. Everybody presumes that, but to actually know it's there would be a socially transformative event. And we might put down our M16s and our cruise missiles and our drone controls and say, hey, let's go on out there and find out what's going on. And, of course, that doesn't work to the interests of the warmongers and the oil companies and the rest of it who just want things to go on exactly the way they are right now. Hey, it's the end of August. You should be out there doing your Christmas shopping. And again, Obama is the first president to preside over a nation without a national manned space program since Eisenhower. And I was looking through some of my old NASA memorabilia, and I stumbled across a story, and I remember when this happened. Back in 1963, the military actually launched a ring of copper needles around the Earth. And this was before the age of communication satellites, where they were looking for ways to guarantee communication across the globe. Because shortwave communication is dependent on the ionosphere, and the ionosphere is dependent upon solar activity, and especially during daylight hours, shortwave doesn't work very well. So they literally put up a Saturn-like ring of copper needles around the Earth. You couldn't see them. There wasn't enough of them to see. But I remember this was during the period of the Mercury missions. A lot of people on the civilian side over at NASA was saying, how do we know we're not going to run into these things? And by now, of course, they probably all deorbited and burned up. But some of those military programs just are so harebrained. Yeah, it's amazing. Look back on some of the stuff that they were doing. Phone lines are open. 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Dan the Man is now sitting in our control room, managing the Truth Warp Drive, and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Kind of a very, very bizarre story. And this has to do, this was being reported over at OgamaHerald.com, and it involves this rather interesting story where this family were very angered over the revelation that their kid had been molested by a teacher at the local school. And apparently the school administration is a very tight-knit group of friends. It's a clique. And the teacher actually had to plead guilty to first-degree criminal sexual conduct against the family of the son. And vandals apparently burned their garage down. And I mention this, first of all, because this whole idea of child sexual molestation, I still don't get it. I really don't get it, whether it's the clergy or teachers or whatever. I just really don't get it. There's something weird going on there. But in the larger context of this school administration all being buddy-buddy and wanting to protect their teacher who was caught molesting the kid, it's the same mechanism we see in the church. We were talking about Pope Francis yesterday, who, even as he said we're going to have stricter Vatican penalties for molesting priests, also said we're going to throw anybody in the jail who reports a sexual crime by the clergy. So they're just sort of all coming in and taking care of themselves at the expense of their congregations or their students. And I think, getting back to what John Kerry was saying about a moral compass, I think America has pretty much lost theirs. Not so much lost, it's been stolen. And I know that the clergy like to preach morality, and John Kerry likes to preach morality, but you've got to lead by example. Because this idea of do as we do, don't do as we say, never has worked throughout history. And when you have teachers who say behave a certain way and then they themselves are off having their jollies, or when you have a clergy saying, you know, follow the Ten Commandments, and then they're off in the choir loft with the kiddies and stuff, that message gets out. And certainly within America's political leadership, we have seen that, where they're out there saying, this is the law, and you must comply, and you must be honest, and you must be honest, and you must work hard. And then we see that that's not the way they live their own lives. I think Americans' moral compass has been poisoned. And I don't mean morality being handed down by some religious authority, but I think most people, if they sit down and really think about it, will on their own come to conclude that there are some universal rules that if we all sort of agree to live by, it just makes society work a lot better. And unfortunately, there's a lot of corporate media that's out there glamorizing breaking the rules. We see how people who break the rules become incredibly rich on Wall Street. Wall Street openly admits they engage in fraud at least 25% of the time. Government won't do anything about it. And then we wonder why our kids are kind of growing up a little bit messed up. And as we talk about the blueprint for the new America, I want to make something very, very clear. I am absolutely opposed to government getting involved in the issue of personal morality. It is socially destabilizing. Because everybody has a different idea of what morality ought to be. And I'll give you a good example, this whole issue of gay marriage. If you're opposed to gay marriage, don't marry a gay, problem solved. But look how much social discord is happening when you have this group over here saying that their imaginary playmate in the sky says homosexuality is a sin and wrong and has to be dealt with, coming over to this other group in society and saying you have to live your life the way we think you ought to live it, which carried to the national scale, of course, is an engraved invitation to more war. But I think, coming up on what appears to be a major social upheaval, that I think people need to reconnect with their own internal sense of what is good behavior and what is moral. And certainly, let the children be children has to be very up high on that list. Growing old is a one-way street. And once children are not children anymore, there's no going back. So let them stay kids as long as they can. Don't mess around with them. And I don't mean just introducing them to carnal pleasures on the benefit of the molester, but even advertising. Advertising is trying to get them to grow up and be consumers and be fashion conscious way too soon. There's always time for that later on. But I think that most people, and I realize there are some people with wires screwed up in their head who wind up in prison or Congress, but I think 95% of the human race, if left to decide for themselves, are going to work out a pretty good workable moral code for all of society. We understand not killing, not stealing, not lying. are all good ideas. Good foundation. I'm going to take a break for commercials. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to take a phone call. Des in New York. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. This is first-time caller. I really appreciate all the information that you've been putting out all this time. I've been listening to you for like the last year now, and I've gotten more information from you than I've gotten any place else.
Thank you.
But the point I wanted to make was when you mentioned moral compass. It's only a matter of time before the people who you govern start to mimic the government. And if the government shows that it's lawless and can do whatever the hell they want, isn't it a matter of time before the society starts to copy?
You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. You know, all organized hierarchical structures adopt the manners and morals of the people at the very, very top. And it doesn't matter what the people at the top say, it's how they act and how they're seen acting that everybody says, okay, you know, humans see, human do. I'm going to do what they did because they've got the money and the power and success, and that must be how they did it. And so there's a huge disconnect in our society between those who use the brand of morality as a means of controlling the people, like John Kerry tried to do yesterday, versus those who decide for themselves, there are certain things I will not do in life because I'm not comfortable with them, and I don't think they benefit society as a whole for me to behave this way.
Right, I totally agree. And there's one other thing. When you're looking at World War II and all the stuff that Hitler tried to get across, you know, taking over nations left and right. The last thing he was thinking about, maybe he wasn't thinking about it at all because he was crazy, but the guys who were his generals and all these other people who were following the orders, after the World War, they actually didn't plan on not being on top. But obviously they didn't. They got, you know, taken over by the Allies and Russia.
Nobody ever does. Nobody starts a war planning on what they're going to do if they lose.
Right, but here's the thing. During the Nuremberg trials, following orders was never a good enough reason to get you off.
No,
all
it wasn't.
These guys hung.
That's right.
So are any of these people who are actually just following orders, let's say like Secretary of State and all these other people who are authorizing all these wars of aggression on behalf of the United States, do they ever stop to wonder that if they lose and end up, you know, the next Pax China ends up being on top after this is all said and done, do they ever stop to wonder if they happen to be taken up on war crimes and taken up on trial?
Well,
what would their excuse be?
They've been thinking about that because starting all the way back during the Bush presidency, the U.S. government went out to other countries to obtain treaties saying that U.S. government officials could not be arrested inside those nations and sent to The Hague. And only last week we had Obama was asking the Department of Justice for indemnification for all of these people in the Bush administration to protect them against war crimes charges. Now, that, of course, only applies inside the United States of America and allows the United States to refuse extradition. But if the U.S. gets into a war with Russia or China and does actually use, then, yeah, all of these people are going to be subject to arrest, and there'll be a tribunal. And just saying I followed orders will not get them off any more than it did the Nazis. And that's absolutely true. I'm sure probably a lot of these people already have plans to simply vanish, change identities. We know a lot of Nazis wound up down in South America. Mengele's a good case. Apparently he was brought to the United States initially as part of Operation Paperclip and actually had a dental practice in New Jersey for about 2 years before he moved down to South America.
Right, those are all the scientists that they actually imported from post-Nazi Germany, correct?
That's exactly right. Operation Paperclip, which is why we got Werner von Braun and the Russians didn't.
Oh, okay. We can only hope. Hey, thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you very much for the phone call. I think morality ought to be a personal choice because we've seen imposed moral codes as part of that system of control. The Vikings, you will not get into heaven unless you die with a sword in your hand. That's not for the benefit of the Vikings getting hacked to death. It's for the benefit of the leaders who profit by having people who are willing to get into Valhalla by being in combat to the very, very death, and so forth and so on. But again, as we talk about the blueprint for the new America, and we do need to be talking about that right now, I think government ought to stay out of issues of personal morality. I think the government's, one of the biggest mistakes the U.S. government ever did was allowing one group to come in and say, our religion says this is wrong, therefore you will pass laws against it. And that is not the proper function of government. The proper function of government is to do for the community what the community needs but cannot do for themselves individually. And anything else the government is doing in terms of trying to change your lifestyle or change your thinking or impose some other system of control on you is not a legitimate function of government. And it never really was. When the Founding Fathers set up this country, the federal government was there to arbitrate between the states. The states had the power. They wanted a small, weak central government because the Founding Fathers understood that with a strong central government, it would become irresistible to the very sort of people who should not be allowed political power over others. But I guess every nation goes through a life cycle. Nation gets started with the best of intentions and the best of noble desires and goals and taking care of the people, and bit by bit the corruptors come in, the money junkies come in, the power-mad leaders who want to own it all and rule it all and stand up on top of temples built to their imperishable glory screaming, I'm the king of the world. They'll come in and they'll work tirelessly to turn a nation to their own purposes and away from the purposes of the people. And that's, of course, what happened here to the United States of America. Wall Street is all about Wall Street. The private central bank's all about the private central bank. The government is not listening to the American people. They're listening to their stockbrokers. You will make money if you do this. You will get more campaign donations if you do that. And the system really does become corrupted. But again, I think we're getting very, very close to the whole thing just falling apart. And another reason I think so is if you go back and you study the news reporting in the Soviet Union in its final days, you will see that there was just as much chaos and thrashing around in government proclamations and excuses and justifications for what they were doing just before it really began to fall apart. And I think we're basically at that point here. So stay calm. I think it's going to happen. Just like the Soviet Union, I think the United States is going to go away. We're going to have a better world without it. And our main task as Americans is to choose for ourselves what the next government of this land will be. And not just sit back and let some carpetbagger working for the private central bank come on back in and say, we got a new government for you, got a new private central bank, just sign your name right here and we'll be good to go. Because I'll tell you right now, way up on the top of the list of the blueprint for the new America, anybody coming in and daring to suggest having a private central bank issue the public currency as a loan at interest has to be tarred, feathered, hanged, drawn, quartered, burned, and the ashes peed on by a rabid dog. Alrighty, now China's reporting they just got hit with a huge hacker attack. Major denial of service attack across all of China. And I'm getting very, very worried about the possibility of a virtual 911. As I mentioned earlier in the show, Janet Napolitano in her farewell speech as head of the Department of Homeland Security made a point of saying America's at risk of a cyber attack by the evil terrorists out there. And we saw the NASDAQ. Well, actually, all three markets here in the U.S. got hit with something last week that shut NASDAQ down, but it spiked the volume on all three markets. Then yesterday we were reporting the Deutsche Börse trading their derivatives back and forth. They got hit with some kind of a problem. I think somebody is running tests to see what it's going to take to bring the whole net and financial system crashing down, and I think it's the U.S. and Israel. And I predict, I foresee that at the point where they cannot keep this illusion of a functioning economy going any further, it is the U.S. government that's going to crash all these computers and blame it on Iran, Russia, China, whatever, to duck the responsibility for the fact that it is Wall Street's crimes, corruptions, and predations, the Federal Reserve predation, and Washington, D.C.'s acquiescence that screwed up what used to be the greatest nation on earth. And these are not people who are willing to stand up and take responsibility for what they've done. They're going to find a scapegoat, even if they have to create one out of thin air. And so the fact that Napolitano made it a point of mentioning this in her farewell speech, I think they're thinking about it. And I think all of these little glitches that we're seeing all over the place, I think somebody's testing. I think somebody's testing how to do it, how to shut it all down and find some way to frame Iran or Russia or China for it. So we're not out of the woods here yet. We have a government that's desperate to distract from all of its scandals and failings with a new world war, and we just have to stand up and say, no. We fell for that twice before in 1907 and 1929. We're not going to fall for it again. This nation is messed up because Wall Street and Washington, D.C. messed it up. You got into this mess without our permission. You will get out of it without our help, certainly without our young men and women dying in a war. We'll be right back. Oh, no, we've got one more minute. Welcome back to the show, and we're going to wrap the program up here going back to the situation in Syria because we're not out of the woods on that one. To recap from the first part of the show, we're seeing indications that the Obama White House understands that nobody bought this nonsense about Assad launching a chemical weapons attack on women and children right in front of the UN inspectors on the day they arrived. And the head of Syria's largest Kurdish group just came out and said, of course Assad would not be that stupid. Nobody is buying this. There's a Syrian activist, Aysar Midani, who's come out saying that there is actually satellite imagery confirming this was another stunt by the rebels to be blamed on Assad, as those leaked documents from Britham back in January said was the plan. Article coming out of 12160, the attack on Syria would be the most unpopular war ever in U.S. history, even more unpopular than King George III was during the American Revolution. Now, the war hawks are already out there screaming that Obama will lose credibility if he doesn't continue and launch a military assault. Oh, you want to maintain your... Well, you've already lost your credibility with that lame story. You don't have any credibility. You're just being pressured to go on with this. By the way, they're backing off the story about Assad hitting those women and children with chemical weapons. The new spin coming out of the White House is, we know Assad has chemical weapons. We have to go in there because he might use them on us. So we're moving away from Assad did this to we have to invade because Assad might do something. Okay, same reason they went into Iraq. He's got nuclear weapons. He might want to use them on us. Same thing they're trying with Iran. They're building nuclear weapons. They might want to. It's all about we have to invade because they might do something to us. And that's a tough sell because, again, the same logic applies. Why would Assad be that stupid to launch a chemical weapon attack on the United States of America when it means instant, immediate U.S. military retaliation? And the answer is no, he's not going to do it. They're just struggling. They're trying to find something to get traction with the American people. And they're trying all these trial balloons, and none of them are flying. And the more trial balloons they do, the more obvious it is. They're just making this stuff up. So I think Obama realizes he can't press this position and enjoy the confidence of the American people, and apparently talk of impeachment is circulating in the halls of Congress right now. And I'll tell you the real danger, and I did mention this earlier in the show, but I want to mention it again because it's an idea we all need to be thinking about and talking about. We know that leaders will gladly sacrifice military assets, including the lives of the military themselves, in order to achieve a political end. Roosevelt did it in Pearl Harbor. Early in 1941, Roosevelt was already talking about a plan to sacrifice naval cruisers to get the U.S. into the war with Japan and Germany and Italy. And that's what happened at Pearl Harbor. Yeah, lure the Japanese in and let them blow up a couple of ships, and who cares about all the sailors on board the ship? That's what they're there for. They're there to be killed. We know that the Israeli government deliberately attacked the USS Liberty. The official story, it was foggy and cloudy. Go back and look at the actual photos and movies shot on the ship while it was under attack. Clear blue sky, unlimited visibility. We've had some of the pilots from that come in and admit, yeah, we knew it was a U.S. ship. We were told to attack this U.S. ship. And while the attack was underway, Israel was telling the United States and the world, oh, Egypt is attacking your ship. It's the Egyptians. Go get them. So Israel has a prior history of attacking U.S. ships and trying to sink them in order to blame somebody else. Now, because this lie about Assad and chemical weapons has cratered, The war hawks have to understand there is no lie or claim they can make about Iran that is going to get the American people to go along with an invasion of Iran. So right now, as near as I can conclude, the only way they can get this war program back on track and get into a war with Iran is for Israel, or maybe even the U.S. itself, to attack one of the U.S. destroyers off the coast of Syria and blame Iran for it. And we need to be watching out for that. When those destroyers start launching cruise missiles at Syria, and let's be honest, who would blame Assad for shooting back? It is entirely possible and reasonable to suggest that Israel would take one of those Dolphin-class submarines Germany gave them, which Germany itself admits they've known for years. Israel arms those Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. Israel sneaks in, and once the cruise missiles are on their way to Syria, they nuke the 4 destroyers, send them to the bottom of the Mediterranean, and say, oh my goodness, Iran did it. It proves they had nuclear weapons. We were right all along. We have to invade Iran now. Because short of a stunt like that, I can't think of any way this government thinks they're going to sell a war with Iran to the American people following this embarrassment here in Syria. The promoters of this war, whether it's the Federal Reserve, the U.S. government, Israel, the military-industrial complex, they are desperate because they understand they can't just quit here and say everything's hunky-dory. This war to reimpose Bretton Woods back on the world, this war to impose private central banking on the world, this war to bring back the petrodollar is an all-or-nothing deal. They can't stop halfway. They have to keep going. They're looking for ways to keep the war going. The wars, plural, going. If they stumble in Syria, it's all over. If Assad hangs on to power, and it looks like he's going to weather this current crisis just fine, enthusiasm for another war in Iran is definitely going to fail. And now they can't lie us into it. They just realized that, belatedly. They can't lie us into a war with Iran. So I can't think of any other way they're going to get a war with Iran going without sinking a U.S. warship and claiming Iran did it. Or Assad did it using a nuclear weapon Iran gave him, or some other concoction, because they're going to have to go for it all now. They're going to have to shoot the moon. They're going to have to invade everybody that they need to invade all at the same time. Because protests against these wars are organizing. People are calling their Congress critters. They're calling their local TV and media stations. They're talking with each other at their places of employment, at their churches, at their schools, at the shopping mall, about how incredibly stupid this whole idea was. That Assad is going to bring in the UN chemical weapons inspectors, then stage a chemical attack on women and children right in front of them. They jumped the shark with this one. So we need to be prepared for something really big to get this war going again, because the people behind it know they can't stop. By hook or by crook, they need to get this moving forward. They need to get into Iran. And by doing so, they're risking war with Russia and China, who have the resources to prevail in a conventional war. And that means we're literally risking global nuclear war. All for a piece of paper with pretty colored ink all over it. That's what this is really all about. This clash of civilizations is a war between private central banking and those nations that dare, like Hungary, to issue a government currency, public currency is public utility, interest-free. That's what it's really all about. If you have not already seen it, you need to see that video, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, and you need to send it with all your friends, because it lays out how hundreds of millions of human beings have been sent to horrible death and disfigurement, all for a private central banking scam to impose itself on the globe as the ultimate fascist global dictatorship. Now is not the time to be silent. Now is the time to stand up and make as much noise as you can everywhere you can. If you stay silent, you are part of the problem. There's our music. We're going to get out of here and get something useful done with the rest of the day. We'll be back here tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay well, stay skeptical, stay angry. Get the word out there. No war. We know the government is lying, and aloha, America.